Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and give a nice warm LinkedIn welcome for your host of today's speaker series, Meg Garlinghouse.
Hello, and welcome to the speaker series. I'm Meg Garlinghouse, and I lead our social impact work at LinkedIn, and I'm the host of today's event. As you guys probably know, the LinkedIn Speaker Series brings in inspiring ideas and innovative thinkers to help each of us, our employees and our members, be more productive. If you want to see the replay of this speaker or any of our past speakers, you can go to speakers.linkedin.com to learn more. So back to why we're here today. I have the honor of introducing Eric Liu. Eric, as you probably have read, is the CEO of Citizen University and the author of the book that's on your chair, You Are More Powerful Than You Think. I met Eric, I think about a year ago, and was incredibly inspired by his conviction and his belief that the more people that join in the proverbial town hall, the more likely that we as individuals and as communities and as a country will be better. So regardless of your political belief, I am 100% confident that you will walk out of here moving from being a spectator of the events before us and moving into being an engaged citizen and more informed on how to do that right. So with that, let me introduce Eric Liu.
Thanks, Meg. Thank you so much, Meg. Thanks to all of you for coming today, and I also just want to thank the entire team here that's put on the speaker series, and Rochelle Diamond in particular has been such a great partner and champion here. Yes. I think you all know you have something kind of special here. I do a lot of speaking in a lot of different settings, both corporate and campuses and so forth, and the care with which Rochelle and Meg and their colleagues have planned not just this event, but been thinking about the moment that we're in and the ways that we could actually have a meaningful conversation about citizen power in a time where there's so much turbulence and change in politics, both nationally and locally. Something I really appreciated, that this wasn't just about the logistics of doing an event. So in that spirit, I really wanted just to today frame up a few remarks for, 20 some minutes or so, and then leave as much of the balance of the time as we can for conversation. And that conversation can take the form of Q&A if you like, but if you're also moved just to share your own thoughts or feelings about whatever's going on or something I may have brought up, as Meg said, kind of a town hall spirit too. Be great to have that conversation. And I know that there are folks watching on the live stream as well, and we hope we'll hear from your questions too. So let me give you a bit of context for the message that I've got. The title of this book, You're More Powerful Than You Think, A Citizen's Guide to Making Change Happen, is not just a feel-good kind of line. It's actually a fundamental belief that animates what we do at Citizen University. That's the nonprofit that I founded and I run. And the reason why I feel like this book is necessary right now has nothing to do particularly with the politics of the Trump era. It has to do actually with tectonic shifts that have been going on in this country for many decades, well before this election, well before the changes we're seeing in civic life right now. We're living in a remarkable moment. I think all of you who work at LinkedIn know this because you are in some ways part of it. You are part of the tech dimension of the multiple revolutions that we're experiencing right now. But even if you're not in tech, people feel and know and sense the ways in which we're in a time where all kinds of hierarchies, all kinds of establishments, all kinds of top-down command and control structures of decision-making, of buying, of participation and engagement have been collapsing. In some cases replaced by disruptive new networks, whether a LinkedIn or social media platforms. In other cases replaced by nothing in particular, but a lot of chaos, right? And if you think about the ways in which this last presidential election showed the kind of shaky foundations of both of the major parties in this country, and that the politics even of the last few months show that both parties continue to be quite shaky in their foundations. This isn't just about Republicans and Democrats in 2017. This is about a multi-decade process in which so many of our institutions have begun to become obsolete. And the reason why that is, I think, is that over these same 3 or 4 decades, we've been living in a period of some of the most immense, radical, severe concentration of wealth, opportunity, and voice that this country has seen. We've got inequality at levels in the United States not seen since before the Great Depression. And it's been happening in slow motion since about the 1970s. And so for most of the lifetimes of most of the people in this room right now, this has just been the proverbial frog being boiled to death degree by degree, right? Till you realize at a certain point, holy cow, I'm boiled, right? And that's where the country is right now. Holy cow, we're boiled, right? And so the anger that we've seen in our political culture over the last few years is part of what I think of as a great pushback. You have a moment right now where you have this kind of concentration of wealth, opportunity, voice, and clout. And in a country that is nominally democratic, in a country that nominally purports to be about equality for all, you can only have so much of that kind of concentration and inequality before people across the left and the right start saying, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore, right? So that is the Trump movement, that is the Sanders movement. But rewind a bit. That was Occupy Wall Street, that was the Tea Party, right? Across the left and the right. And apart from even economic grievances, this is the rise of Black Lives Matter. This is the rise of the Dreamers, undocumented Americans who are organizing and coming out of the shadows to claim their space in civic life and in the public square. This is the emergence of the $15 Now movement. This is the emergence of so many movements across different social, economic, and political issue areas in this time. And this moment that we're in right now is the age of bottom-up citizen power, right? And so what I want to talk about today is how we can make sense of this age. Because while we read the headlines and look around and see all of this turbulence and all of this kind of cascading swarm of citizen action right now on these different issues across the political spectrum, for you, just as an individual, for each of us, it can be a harder question to answer to say, well, what's my piece of this? How do I plug in? What's my responsibility? Am I supposed to show up? Am I supposed to engage? Am I supposed to keep a distance? Am I supposed to stay away because this is too hot and too political? How do I participate in a time of change like this that is so tectonic and so foundational? And so what I wanted to do today is to talk about three things. Number one, just what I mean by citizen power. Number two, I want to talk about three laws of power that'll help us kind of make sense of this moment. And then lastly, I want to talk about three imperatives for action that we've got to take seriously once we understand these laws of power. So let me kind of quickly go through these things. So what do I mean by citizen power? I mean something very specific. When I say citizen, whether in the context of this book or power, or in the context of the name of our organization, I'm not talking about documentation status under the immigration laws of the United States, right? I'm talking about citizen in a bigger ethical sense of being a member of the body, a contributor to community, a pro-social contributor to community, right? And I think the reality is, and we know this, you certainly know this living in California, there are plenty of people who have the documents but don't live like citizens. And then there are plenty of people who lack the documents but do, right? So number one, that's what I mean. But when I talk about power, what do I mean by power? Well, I mean simply this, a capacity to ensure that others do as you would like them to do. Now, for some people, that's kind of a menacing, domineering sounding kind of definition. It makes people kind of just withdraw and feel, that sounds a little dirty, right? Or it sounds a little bit like Game of Thrones or House of Cards or something like, I'm going to screw you over. I'm going to take things over, right? But if you have any such qualms or misgivings about this candid definition of power, I truly urge you to get over it. Because our responsibility right now, in this moment of tectonic change, is to not be willfully ignorant about the nature of power. It is to recognize that every one of us, as humans, has this yearning and desire to ensure that others do as we'd like them to do, but also every one of us as humans has a capacity, a set of capacities to actually make that kind of change happen, right? And one of the things that is both exciting but also frustrating about this moment is that even as we see the headlines and see all of these folks stepping off the sidelines and participating and going to marches and on all sides of a political issue, people are remembering that they have power. But they're also then coming quickly up against the limits of their literacy in power, right? And literacy is a metaphor I use quite intentionally. You have to be able to know how to read and write power. You have to understand how the people, the institutions, the conduits, the networks through which power flows in a society actually work, right? You have to understand the core question of power in civic life, which is simply this: who decides? Who decides, right? At every fractal scale, whether it's the curriculum that your local school district is going to use, whether the state of California is going to build light rail, whether the United States is going to sign on to the Paris Climate Accord. In all of these questions, they boil down to a simple nut of who decides. And if you can't really answer the question who decides, then you aren't fully literate in power, right? You can't read the map of power. But once you actually learn how to read the map of power and know how a bill becomes a law, or how an idea becomes a policy, or how a hashtag becomes a movement, or how a message becomes a rallying cry for an entire shift of social norms, once you know how to read that, then you actually begin to pivot to the second piece, which is how do you write power? How do you actually author change in civic life, right? And this brings me to the second piece that I wanted to talk about here today, which is 3 laws of power in civic life that I think are really important to bear in mind when you think about how you want to make change, whether at the neighborhood level, in the workplace, or as a citizen of the United States, or as a member of a global diaspora or community. So here are the 3 laws that I want to talk about. Law number 1, power compounds. That is a simple fact and a simple reality that particularly those of you in technology know, that network effects and the ways in which initial advantages compound and reinforce themselves is the story of the internet. It is the story of how Facebook became Facebook and LinkedIn became LinkedIn and Twitter became Twitter, right? This is the way in which initial advantages compound. Power and advantages compound, but so does powerlessness and disadvantage, right? The rich get richer, the poor get poorer, but also those with some clout tend to get more clout. Those who get some visibility, who get quoted in the paper or in the news about as experts on one thing, tend to get quoted again and again, right? And the concentrating, self-reinforcing feedback loops of power, especially in a networked age, is law number 1. Power concentrates and it compounds. Law number 2 is something that also we intuit, and yet we don't often name, and that is that power justifies itself. At every turn, individuals and institutions that are incumbent holders of power will spin elaborate narratives about why it ought to be that way, right? And so let's take a couple of things that are just in the news these days. White supremacy, right? And I'm not talking about white nationalism of the kind of swastika-wearing brand, right? That's easy to say, oh, that's a terrible thing, right? White supremacy, the idea that white is right, the idea that white should be the default setting of our institutions, the idea that whiteness is the norm toward which anybody who's not white should aspire to. That is, in places and in forms, far more prevalent than swastika-wearing hate mongers, right? But what is attached to that prevalent norm is a storyline that many of us have internalized and many of us have kind of stopped thinking about, that says that America is a white Christian country. And it was made for white Christian people to be a beacon of hope and to civilize the rest of the world, right? There's a narrative there. That kind of narrative, when you actually unpack it and peel it apart, is, you realize, a myth. It's not based in fact, but it is a narrative generated and fed in all these different ways to justify prior allocations of power. You can think of many other such narratives of male supremacy, right? And why it is that men ought to be dominating in leadership positions in business and technology, for instance. Why it is that the tech field should be tilted toward men, because, fill in your storyline, because women aren't good at math, because women aren't good at dealing with things, they're good at dealing with people, because women, all these storylines that are spun that, again, have at best a flimsy basis in fact, but are spun up as self-justifying fables to defend and rationalize and justify the current allocations of power, right? When you say it, you see it, right? So that's law number 2. Now, if all we had were laws number 1 and number 2, that power is always concentrating and compounding, and that power is always justifying itself in these self-reinforcing ways, we'd be stuck in a pretty grim situation, right? This kind of doom loop in which fewer and fewer people get almost everything and tell you why you should be happy about that, right? What breaks us out of that doom loop, though, is law number 3, and it is this: power is infinite. really want you to sit with this for a minute. Power is infinite. What I mean by this is several things. What I mean in the first place is that power in civic life, unlike heat or energy in a physical system, is not a zero-sum finite kind of deal, right? The laws of physics and thermodynamics tell us that if someone in this room is going to get more heat or energy, someone else in this room has to get less, right? And that's our intuition from physics. But I'm not talking physics, I'm talking civics. And in civic life, it is wholly possible for someone who has less power at the moment to generate brand new additional power out of thin air without taking a drop of power from someone else, right? And you generate that brand new power out of thin air through the magic act of organizing. Organizing, engaging and activating and awakening 1 or 2 or 10 or 1,000 other humans in a common endeavor with common goals, common strategies, common tactics that create a sense of common cause and common purpose. That is magic. And that creates power where it did not exist. And every movement that I was reciting earlier, $15 Now, Dreamers, Black Lives Matter, Tea Party, Libertarians, the free speech movement, all these movements that are arising in our time right now, and that's just the United States. Arab Spring, Umbrella Movement, Orange Revolutions, Maidan Revolutions. All around the world right now, you have instances of people who are organizing and generating power where it did not previously exist. Right? And that is the infinitude of power that allows us to break out of seemingly stuck, seemingly zero-sum, seemingly finite situations of encrusted allocations of power. Now, when I say that power is infinite, I want to be clear. I don't mean that any one of us, just by wishing it to be so, can be infinitely powerful. No, right? I can't just make myself infinitely wealthy by hoping for it. But what I can do, and what no one can stop me from doing, is to bring a few other folks together to come up with new ideas, new ways of combining and amplifying our ideas power, our people power, our social norms power, our reputational power, our institutional power, to shift the allocation in a given setting, right? Nothing stops me from doing that. I opened this book with a story of tomato pickers from Immokalee, Florida. Some of you may have heard of Immokalee, some of you may have heard about these tomato pickers. It's a famous story among people who are engaged in the work of community organizing and activism. Immokalee is the place where a great proportion of the tomato crop of the United States is grown every year. And for decades, that crop was picked by migrant workers from South and Central America, many of them undocumented, who for most of the 20th century lived in conditions of not just indentured servitude, but one little notch away from slavery. They were completely off the grid of the national media. They were completely out of view of the mainstream economy, and they were completely exploited, subject to wage theft, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and they suffered like this for many, many years until in the early 1990s, a few of them started saying, let's meet after our shift. Let's meet in the warehouse, let's meet at church, and let's figure out what we can do together to actually change this. And they began organizing, they began striking, and they began demanding small things at first, heat shelters for the middle of the day, water breaks, maybe an increase in their pay from a penny a bucket to a penny and a half a bucket of tomatoes. But once they started doing that, they realized, holy cow, we actually just shifted the entire equation. We could probably do more of this. And they began to organize the next level up and realizing that it wasn't just the growers who were exploiting them who were the problem, that one link up in the chain, it was the buyers, the fast food chains and the supermarkets who were putting pressure on the growers to drive wages down to close to zero. And so then they began to get allies from outside of their little closed environment, their little seemingly finite, seemingly zero-sum plot of land there. And they began getting allies in the media, allies in faith organizations, allies in immigrant activism groups, allies in labor. And they began to apply pressure on those buyers. And they generated this group of literally illiterate, unlettered immigrants, many of them undocumented, helping to organize what became a fair food code, which then forced the buyers, the Taco Bells, the Safeways, what have you, to begin to abide by a set of different practices and say, we're not going to buy from growers unless they abide by these particular standards of conduct, right? And over the course of just a few years, this group of tomato pickers in Immokalee completely changed the game, the story, and the equation of power, right? So this is what I mean when I say power is infinite. I don't mean, therefore, that the tomato pickers now run the joint, because what happens when you generate new power is that the folks who previously had power figure out that they can generate new power too, right? And there's a simple word for this: politics, right? Politics in an open democratic space means that as one group starts to organize and change its prior allocation of power, other groups in countervailing ways decide they'll have to organize anew or in different ways. And this is the tug and the pull and the swirl of modern-day democratic politics, right? Well, these three laws, that power compounds, that power justifies itself, and that power nonetheless is infinite, lead us to the final thing I want to talk about here today, which is three imperatives for action for us, right? So if in the first place, power is always compounding into these winner-take-all monopolistic games, then our first imperative is simply to change the game, right? And during our conversation, I can give you some more examples of what I mean by that, but let me just kind of run through these three imperatives first. In the second place, if power is always justifying itself with these narratives of why things are the way they are and why those who have and those who have not, then our second imperative is to change the story. And then in the third place, if in fact power is infinite, and yet so many people are stuck in a mindset of it being finite and zero-sum, then our third and final imperative is to change the equation, right? And so in all these things, changing the game and changing the story and changing the equation, there are a variety of strategies that we, any one of us, you don't have to be a professional politico, you don't have to be somebody who's spent a day in activism or organizing, you don't have to be somebody who even thinks of yourself as political. All of these imperatives yield a set of strategies. In the book, each of these three has three strategies attached to it. So there are 9 strategies that I describe in the book for how we activate citizen power to change the game, story, and equation. But I want to give you one concrete example just from my own life as a citizen in Washington State. After Sandy Hook happened, after the massacre in Sandy Hook, I was in North Carolina with a colleague of mine, and we were flying back to Seattle. And on that flight back, as we were seeing our Twitter feeds explode about this tragedy, we said to ourselves, we got to do something. Like the feeling of helplessness and grief and anger was so overwhelming. And we decided that what we would have to do was actually organize some of our fellow Seattleites and Washingtonians to act. And so literally, when we hit the ground, we called a meeting. And we called a meeting of a few other active, engaged, connected citizens, and we started meeting. And over the course of a few meetings in a few days, right after Sandy Hook, we determined that we've got to create a grassroots organization in this state that's going to change gun laws in Washington State. We decided that the arena of Congress was, for the moment, too resistant and too distantly kind of movable, but that the arena of Washington State was certainly one that we felt like we could move, right? And so we organized, and we initially got together and got some policy experts together, and we landed on this idea that we needed to have in Washington State a law requiring universal background checks for purchases of firearms, right? And we thought, well, this state has a Democratic governor, a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate. This should be a piece of cake. Let's actually put this piece of legislation, get someone to sponsor this, and bam, we'll be there, right? Well, we hit a wall, right? And the wall we hit was the game that the gun lobby had been playing for many years, which was they recognized that when legislation happens, when proposed legislation arises to change gun laws, that they don't need to worry about public opinion as a whole. They just need to think about getting a critical mass of pivotal swing legislators to be reluctant to make any changes. And so they applied pressure, they applied money, they applied people on a few swing Democratic legislators. And those Democratic legislators were enough to kill this bill in session. It didn't even get a hearing, right? And so we realized, wow, as long as we play the game of the NRA and the gun lobby, we are going to lose. And so our first imperative was, we got to change the game, right? We can't play within this arena defined by that entity. And so fortunately in Washington, as it is in California, we had a bypass available. And we decided to expand the arena and go straight to the people. And so we put together a different group of folks, and we created an organization that was initially called the Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility, and we said, we're going to put a measure on the ballot because the legislature failed to do what great majorities of the citizens of the state wanted to do. We're going to go straight to the people. And yes, that was more expensive, that was more time-consuming, it was much more complicated to actually gather signatures, to get on the ballot, and so forth. But the act of doing that completely changed the game, right? Just trying to qualify for the ballot awakened people to the ways in which they were no longer powerless, that in looking at the frustration of a democratic legislature sitting on gun responsibility laws, they now had an option to plug in their energy and say, there's something else we can do, right? Well, the second dimension of this, and it's embedded in the name of the organization, the Washington Alliance for Gun Responsibility, is that we change the story and the debate about guns, right? Because that story is usually a story that unfolds as gun rights versus gun control. And we said, you know what? Gun control is not our thing. That's not our language. That's not our idea. We're simply of the view that gun rights, which are part of the Constitution and part of our political and social fabric here, that every right comes with a responsibility. If you're a grown-up, if you're a non-sociopath, if you're something other than a toddler, rights come with responsibilities, right? And most gun owners, actually, most members of the NRA, put aside their leadership, most members of the NRA believe this firmly. They are the first to tell you about gun safety. They're the first to tell you about the ways in which the training and the safety and the storage of firearms is paramount, right? They're not wild-eyed and bought into Washington, D.C. politics. They're just trying to exercise their rights responsibly. And so we changed the story here to say that if you're going to have rights, you got to have responsibility. And one of the most basic responsibilities is to make sure that people with a criminal background or people who pose a threat to themselves or others shouldn't have easy access to firearms. That seems like the most baseline level of responsible common sense, right? So we changed the story. And then by going to the people and activating this statewide ballot measure and creating points of mobilization in not just blue Seattle and blue King County, but in rural communities and small towns across the state, we changed the equation. We made people who had felt like their voice was wasted, their vote was wasted because they weren't part of a community that was going to support these kinds of reforms, we brought them back into the fold and brought them back into participation, right? In the end, this initiative, Initiative 594, passed with over 60% of the vote in Washington. And 2 years later, we passed another ballot measure requiring extreme risk protection orders in case somebody does pose an imminent threat to themselves or others. And we're doing more, right? But I tell you about this particular example as a way to say, none of us was a gun expert. None of us was somebody who was a longtime activist in this way. What we were a group of citizens who said, this is not okay. This is not normal. This is not the way we've got to be in our community. And we mobilized people, ideas, money, social norms to change the game, story, and equation of power here. So what does this mean for what we have to do today? We live in a time right now, I mean, here we are, a couple of days before here in the Bay Area, there's going to be some potentially, well, very disruptive, potentially very catastrophic protests and counter-protests around free speech, support of President Trump, white nationalism, all this kind of bundle of things. Meanwhile, put aside national politics, here in California, here in the Bay Area too, you are living through a period where all those dynamics I was describing earlier of slow motion boiling to death in a realm of inequality is happening kind of intensively in a way where it's not slow motion, it's fast motion, right? And San Francisco is becoming what one political scientist has called a plutonomy, an economy for, of, and by the very rich, and the ways in which that is reverberating into the political and cultural life of the rest of the Bay Area. And the question for you, well, what do you do about that? What do you do about homelessness? What do you do about affordable housing? What do you do about transit? What do you do about creating a community in which it's not just people of a thin slice in the 1%, but one in which there actually is the diversity that makes any entity, any body actually maximally thrive, right? These are questions for you in your neighborhoods, in your communities, whatever part of this region you live in. And then there are simple questions as well that are much more micro of something you may not like happening in your neighborhood or your block, something that's troubling you in your kid's school, right? One of the things that we have to remember is that civic power is not just a topic of what goes on in Washington, D.C., and you read about it in the New York Times or the Washington Post. Civic power is what happens when we show up every day in public. And the note that I want to close on is simply this, to remind us that philosophically, as well as practically, power is a gift. Power is a gift, right? It's a gift in several senses. One, it's a gift in that, we are endowed by our Creator with a capacity to make change and make a difference. And those of us who had the dumb luck to be born in the United States, as I did, are endowed also with the completely unearned privileges of citizenship of the United States, right? And you may think, oh, I'm not so privileged, or I'm struggling, or this or that. If you were born in the United States in the beginning of the 21st century, you're one of the luckiest humans ever to walk the earth, right? And you did exactly zero to earn that, right? Exactly zero. And if those of you who aren't citizens of the United States, you can recognize, too, your own kind of inventory of privilege, your own inventory of power, right? And when you take that inventory and you recognize, wow, I have the ability to voice my opinion freely without retribution. I have the ability to raise money and capital for an idea that I have, to start up something. I have the ability to, with my partner who's of the same sex, or with my spouse who's of a different race, or with my children who don't look like me or their other parent, to walk in a community and feel not persecuted. That these are incredible privileges and blessings, right? And yet most of us, most of the time, simply give away the power that we have by our inattention, by our apathy, by our lack of participation, right? So when you take that inventory of the various forms of privilege and power that you have, that we have together, and you take that honest, candid inventory, you come to a pretty straight binary choice then. Shall I hoard or shall I circulate? That's the question for us right now when it comes to understanding your own power. Shall I hoard or shall I circulate? And I beg of you, as people who are in one of the cutting-edge centers of the cutting edge of the global economy, to not be a hoarder, right? And I mean that in every sense. I mean that kind of economically, to not just think about the purpose of life as accumulating your own wealth and building up a bulwark of your own material security, and kind of look at those who don't have as much as, well, I won. I beat them in the race, right? And to circulate not out of a sense of altruism or mere charity. Some of you have an altruistic bent. Some of you have a charitable instinct. Some of you give very generously, I'm sure, in all different ways. But the case that I want to make for circulation of power, of clout, of wealth, and of voice is not one that's out of the goodness of our hearts only. It's a case based on self-interest properly understood. And that is a recognition that all self-interest is mutual interest. That we're all better off when we're all better off. And that a community like the Bay Area, like San Francisco, can only go so long where a few people build towers of privilege and wall themselves off from the rest of the people before eventually that tower falls. Either because it is unsustainably high or because everyone else decides they'd like to take that tower down, right? It is in our mutual self-interest for the body, for that wealth, for that power to circulate. If you think about the body politic as a body, and you think about how much blood is right now concentrating in 1% of my body, right? Imagine this pinky of mine ballooned to the size of this stage with blood. And you walk into this room and you see a dude standing here with his pinky the size of the stage filled with blood, you'd say, that dude's not healthy. He doesn't have long for this world, right? Something bad is going to happen to that guy pretty soon because most of his blood is in his pinky, right? It is for the good of the body that that blood circulate in a way so that the entire body can thrive. And that is the nature. I know it's very easy in tech. I know it's very easy in Silicon Valley to imagine that the rest of the world is cabined off from you, but it is not. It is not, right? And so this choice that we have to make about whether to hoard or whether to circulate means then to circulate. Once you choose circulation as a matter not only of self-interest, but as a matter of self-preservation, then you recognize that, wow, this gift that we have of power, this gift that we've been throwing away by not voting, by not following the news, by not saying something on the bus when someone says something hurtful or harmful to the woman in the hijab, by not actually stepping forward when one of your relatives brings up an awkward, something awkward, awkwardly racist or awkwardly bigoted. By not engaging in larger systemic and structural challenges and not naming the ways in which implicit bias, white privilege, all these forms of male privilege permeate our institutions. You have to make that choice every single day. It's not just kind of the big moments where there's a march or a rally or a national election. It's about, how am I going to show up today? And when I show up, how am I going to practice power? How am I going to do that in the company of others, right? That's the power and the beauty of why we're doing this together here today, right? LinkedIn, all the networks and platforms that you have globally here, is proof that there's incredible network power to people being connected asynchronously and connected without having to be face-to-face. But at the end of the day, we gathered here today face-to-face, those of us who are here in this room, because we recognize that to heal the body politic and to restore a sense of power and purpose to each other in civic life, we got to do this in the company of each other. We got to see each other. We got to be able to face each other. We have to make hard, risky choices, to ask questions, to build trust, to own our own failings, to own our own ignorance, right? And it is way harder to do that in person than it is online. Because online you can hide, online you can pretend, online you can flame with impunity. But in person, we recognize that we are woven together in this fabric of relationship and obligation, and that it is from that fabric, from that interdependent web, that at the end of the day, all power in civic life flows, emerges, and circulates. So finally, let me just say this, a couple of practical things for you. As you go out today, and after we have our conversation the rest of this morning here, I want you to actually think about 3 things that you can do in the next week. 3 things that you can do to change the game, the story, or the equation of power in some arena of your life, right? Now, some of you already have ideas, and you're already like, oh, I'm super involved on kind of dealing with food deserts in this part of town and trying to bring more sustainable food options, or I'm super involved in climate activism here, or I'm really involved in this issue to kind of help a community that's gentrifying remain inclusive, or whatever it might be. But many others of you are like, I'm not involved in anything. Like, I don't know where I should practice power. I don't even know what that means, right? My challenge to you is actually to think concretely about a few different points of entry that you could actually engage in, right? And it might be driven by a motivation, a care of an issue that is personal to you, or it might be just about where you live physically. But concentrating your minds to think about one arena and deciding in this arena, on this issue, I'm going to give myself a stretch of days to kind of go deep here. I'm going to think about who has power on this issue. I'm going to think about who does not. I'm going to ask why that is. I'm going to try to read and draw that map of power on that issue that I care about. And then I'm going to actually imagine and write down a bunch of ways that I possibly could rewrite that map, right? And maybe some of them are fanciful. Maybe some of them are, at the moment, beyond your seeming skill set or your apparent reach. But just documenting those and imagining those awakens something in us. It awakens this realization again that you're more powerful than you think, but it also awakens this realization that we are more powerful than we think. That at the end of the day, civic power is not about individuals in splendid isolation. It's about us in fellowship and community, pushing each other and challenging each other to wake up, see the world, and engage with one another. So thank you very much for having me this morning, and now let's just kind of open it up for wider conversation.
If you have questions, you can come to the mic. That'd be great. Thank you so much, Eric. I'll kick it off with a question that came in on the stream.
Yep.
Someone was wanting to know how you initially got inspired and engaged.
So there's one layer of it which is about values for me, which is I'm the son of immigrants. My parents were born in China. They fled to Taiwan in 1949, and they came to the United States in the mid-50s. And my household was not particularly political, but there was this kind of ambient ethic in a second-generation Chinese-American household, which I would boil down this way: don't be useless. Right? Those of you who speak Mandarin will know the phrase "没有用," right? "meoyong," means literally like of no use, like useless, right? And that was like the most harsh thing that could be said about you in my household. Like, you're being useless. Like, go do something. Stop complaining. Stop whining. Stop sitting there that you're bored. Like, be useful. Be engaged, right? And so that's one layer of kind of an ethic of you look around and you realize there's really no such thing as someone else's problem, right? Now, that doesn't mean that you can solve everyone's problem, but it does mean that, again, we are in that kind of interwoven network of responsibility. So that's the values layer. I think the next layer above that really was when I went to college. And one of the kind of happenstance things, I went to Yale College, and there's a kind of a clock tower there, and at the base of the clock tower is inscribed a quote from Nathan Hale, who was from the Yale class of 1701, or no, 1703, I think. No, 1775, sorry. Yale class of 1775. Nathan Hale, those of you who are students of American history, was a Revolutionary War a hero and activist who was a spy on the British side. He got caught as a spy. He was executed by the British. And right before he was executed, his most famous last words were, "My only regret is I have but one life to give for my country," right? But his second most famous thing that he ever uttered is actually inscribed in the base of this clock tower. And it was in a letter that he wrote accepting what would be his fatal spy mission. And it was this: "I wish to be useful," right? And at Yale College, there was a culture of engagement, like be of service, be useful, right? And I think that's when I got exposed to politics. That's when I got involved in, did my first internships in Washington, D.C., and understood how that town worked, but also how I understood in a town like New Haven, Connecticut, which was an island of privilege surrounded by a sea of privation, how it's unsustainable to wall yourself off from the suffering of others, right? And what a fantasy it is to imagine that just because I'm in a closed bubble of super smart, super interesting, super capable people, how dangerous it is to begin to think that I deserve it, and everyone else who suffers deserves it too, right? And so being in New Haven in the 1980s shaped me a lot as well in this kind of activism. So I go from there, but I think the deeper thing that I want to say, though, is, again, for all of you, I didn't grow up in a political household. I was not trained by activists. There was no kind of big moment where this was just a gradual decision to practice, right? And I keep using that verb because I think it's super pertinent here. Being engaged in civic life, being powerful in civic life is not a you either got it or you don't kind of deal. It's a matter of practice. It is literally a matter of building muscle, right? And as Americans, we have hugely overdeveloped consumer muscles, right? And we can just at an instant kind of discern all the kind of sub-dimensions of a brand and the meanings of kind of the marketplace and the messages that we're receiving about what to buy and what not to buy. But our citizen muscles are totally atrophied, right? And so just beginning to practice by showing up with others is a thing that I've been doing most of my adult life, and it's gotten me to be doing what I'm doing now. Yes?
Hi, thank you for coming. So I have a slightly, so my thinking about how the world is today, I mean, there's some similarity to what you're talking about, right? I think that the problem is a lot of apathy, right? Most people are not engaged. I think that's the problem that you're trying to tackle. But I also see another problem, which I'd like you to speak to if possible, because your background is, in politics. And the problem is this, the idea that we are now, drifting further and further apart. Okay, I mean, obviously you have a more liberal background, and I'm a liberal. I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying, but a lot of problem in this country is that the two sides are not really speaking to each other, right? Now you talk a lot about power. What about dialogue? In your traversing the state of Washington to talk with all these different people about the gun law that you brought forth, what did you experience there as far as, when you came to talk to people?
What a great question. Thank you for that. And I think it might be the most important question of the moment that we're in right now. I mean, Donald Trump is about to do a rally tonight that is going to perhaps further inflame and polarize politics around issues of identity and immigration and nationalism and so forth. And so I think two things. To me, the problem is not just polarization in the ways in which left and right have become, more sure and more righteous of their worldviews and less able to hear each other. But it's also that what accompanies that is a dehumanization, right? A demonization and a dehumanization of politics. And I think the most important thing that we can do right now, and one of the ways in which we are fully powerful, is to rehumanize politics, is to rehumanize. And that means actually making an affirmative effort to engage, particularly in a face-to-face way, with people whose views differ from your own. And in engaging them, I mean something very specific. I don't mean, for me, yes, I'm a progressive, I've worked for Democrats and so forth. It doesn't mean for me going to somebody on the right and saying, hi, let's argue about gun control, right? Hi, let's talk about $15 minimum wage, right? Why are you so stupid, right? Why are your views so benighted, right? I don't mean engage in a fight like that. I mean, hi, let me tell you how my values were formed. Let me tell you who shaped me. Let me tell you what experiences, good, bad, formative, traumatic, kind of shaped my worldview and shaped my background explanations of how stuff gets done in society and who deserves and who doesn't deserve, right? There's a whole background of life experience to excavate that kind of shows how I came to the views that I have, and then to invite the other person to do the same, right? Now, when they do that, you may or may not, in fact, odds are you won't change your underlying views on issue X or Y, but you will no longer be able to demonize that person because they will have become humanized to you. And let me give you a very concrete example. I've come to know over the last many months now and become friends with Glenn Beck. So Glenn Beck, some of you may know, has been in a very interesting process over the last couple of years of, I wouldn't say a change or metamorphosis so much as a taking of responsibility. He very publicly has been, post this election, coming out there and saying, you know what, I am a big part of how our politics got so toxic and polarized over this last half decade to decade. I fed that. I built a business on that. I got famous off of that, right? And now that I see what that's brought us in our national politics, and now that I'm a grandfather and I think about what I want my grandkids to grow up in, I've decided I have to take responsibility for that, and I have to try to change that, right? And he's been doing this in very public, national, mainly liberal media venues. And he's been getting mainly kind of like, what is this? Is this for real, right? Or people still attacking him and saying, you're not taking enough responsibility, or I don't believe you, right? Well, I found this interesting enough that I, through a mutual friend, engaged him, and I take him at his word. I take him in earnest, and we've come to know each other over the last few months, and he had me down. I spent a day with him in Dallas earlier in the spring, in which we were no cameras, no microphones, we were just talking, just understanding kind of that same thing of how did your views get formed, right? Well, it turns out he grew up near Seattle, right? He grew up in a small town near Seattle, and he grew up with a very complicated, painful family life in which part of his escape was to find his own voice. And part of his way to find his own voice was to grab onto an ideology of libertarianism and conservatism that gave him purpose, right? And the community that he began to build by finding his voice on the radio and building a following gave him a sense of purpose. And I understood this backstory, and we talked about, for the first large chunk of our conversations, we didn't talk about politics, Trump, policy, legislation. We talked about our fathers, right? His complicated relationship with his dad, my foreshortened relationship with my dad, who died when I was 22, right? And the ways in which each of us has been searching for purpose most of our adult lives in the absence of a father, right? After we had that conversation, we then went on to argue about transgender bathrooms. We went on to argue about the minimum wage, and we went at it, right? But at the end of the day, I could not look at this guy and say, you're the devil anymore, right? I had to look at him and say, I feel you. I kind of know you, right? And I think if we do that at scale, and we do that from the bottom up, that's what's going to save and heal our politics. I'm not waiting on a president, and that's not a criticism of this president, right? I have plenty to criticize this president about, but Donald Trump, when he said during the campaign that he alone could solve our country's problems, a lot of people believed him, right? In just the way that when Barack Obama was a candidate in 2008, and he said, "We are the change that we've been waiting for," nobody believed him, right? The same phenomenon in mirror image. Everybody thought Barack Obama was going to be the knight who rode in on a white horse to save us. Just like a whole bunch of other people thought Donald Trump was going to be the knight who rode in on a white horse and was going to save us. No president is going to save us. We are going to do this by deciding, Rochelle and I were talking about this earlier, by deciding with our friends, with our family members, with neighbors, with coworkers whose views are different from our own, that we're going to engage them with respect, with humanity, and with an openness of heart that becomes contagious, right? And again, you all working in the tech field know that we live in the age of contagion, and that if we set norms and lead by example in that way, we can make a cascade of social norms shifts, right? And I do think that it is both possible and necessary for us to kind of heal from the bottom up, the middle out, and the inside out right now. And one last thing I'll tell you about is just a book that I'll refer you to. This, actually, I'll save that because we've got some other questions here.
Time for one more. Do you want to hear the question?
Yeah, why don't we hear all three, and then I'll try to speak to all of them.
My question is kind of around sustainability on energy of people. So, with this organizing, and in the past 7 months, starting with people organizing around the immigration ban, then organizing around healthcare, going to town halls, now organizing on this fight back against white supremacy, these past 7 months have felt like 7 years, right? And so how do you think people can sustain the energy to keep organizing, fighting for the next 4, maybe 8 years?
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks. Mine's more of a PSA in the sense that thank you. Your nods to the hyper-local ways to get engaged are really important and energizing to me. And we have some local leaders here from our local communities that I just wanted to acknowledge that they are living what you're describing, and encourage people here in the room to connect with them after we're done here. So thank you.
These are both philanthropies and civic organizations.
Yes,
here.
City Council, commissioners, Bike Ped, Leadership Mountain View, reading partners. So we have a number of local leaders. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
So we're at LinkedIn. We think a lot about the workplace. We're talking about civic power and politics and activism. I think, paying attention to the controversy around Google right now, there's a lot of confusion and frustration and differences of norms, and people care about a lot of these issues, but there's some limits around what is okay in a workplace. Do you have any guidance and thoughts for people who care about issues but also want to kind of navigate the intersection between politics and the workplace?
Boy, such great questions. So on the first one about sustainability, this is a common question now for a lot of folks. And by the way, I want to keep taking pains, not just on the left, right? I mean, I have many friends who are libertarians, many friends who are reform conservatives, who are as troubled by the drift and shift of our politics right now, and who are trying to organize and trying to be heard and trying to figure out how they maintain legitimacy in a time where their ideas and principles are getting, in some ways, trampled upon. So across the left and the right, this question of sustainability and energy, I think, has to be answered this way, which is, if it feels like eating your vegetables and doing your duty, then there's going to be a hard limit on how much and how long you can do this, right? But it feels more like join the club, join the party, join the family, join the tribe, then you will sustain, right? And I think this is one of the interesting lessons of past movements. Like the civil rights movement was effective not only because it had a moral purpose and because it had effective tactics, but because it fed the spirit as well. A spirit of yearning for purpose, a spirit of yearning for fellowship, a spirit in which joy and art and song and voice and belief could get expressed in imaginative, creative ways, right? And we've seen that throughout these last several months. But I think doing that doing work in community, right? And so when I say get out of your isolation, when I say get engaged, I don't mean like decide that you are going to work on issue X and every week you're going to give half a day or whatever to issue X. Don't do it by yourself. Decide you're going to join a club or make a club, right? Decide, and that club could be 6 of your neighbors. It could be your desk mates here. It could be whatever, right? But decide, it's basically the civic equivalent of CrossFit, right? CrossFit is a phenomenon because it recognizes that it's boring just to work out by yourself in your basement, right? It feeds the soul as well as the body to work out with your tribe, with a group of people where you can see each other and push each other and kind of get excited about it, and then afterwards go eat all the calories that you'll burn off next time, right? That's the spirit that we have to have here. On the second point about the PSA, about the hyperlocal, I am really glad that several of you are here, and I hope you'll actually raise your hands if you are from different community groups here, just so that folks who are in the LinkedIn world can actually come find you and talk about different ways that they might engage. Because I do think that the old Tip O'Neill line that all politics is local is true, but the corollary to that is all citizenship is local. All of the practice of every dimension of power I'm talking about is best practiced at home, right? And whether that home is literally your smallest kind of precinct or a slightly bigger notion of neighborhood or community, this is where you can feel it and touch it and see it, and where actually the change is palpable in a way that is frustratingly not the case in national politics or maybe even in state politics. The third and the final point I think is a big one here about that balance between getting activated as a citizen and your responsibilities in the workplace. I guess I would say this. We live in a time where it's important to err on the side of activism. We live in a time right now where, particularly those of us who have the privilege to work in places like this, there is no such thing as being, quote, apolitical, right? Just as I often say, there's no such thing as not voting, right? Not voting is voting. Not voting is voting to hand your power over to other people whose interests may be inimical to your own, right? Not organizing, not participating is organizing and participating for the people who want to dominate you, right? And so I don't mean on the other, at the other extreme that the workplace should become a hyper-politicized place where everybody's always engaged in partisan fights. No. But I do mean to say that you have to recognize that in the various kind of concentric or overlapping circles of identity that you have, that it's a Venn diagram between kind of your work identity and your civic identity, right? These are not non-intersecting circles. There's an overlap. And the knowledge, the relationships, the capital that you bring to bear in a work environment as privileged as LinkedIn is, means that when you're taking that inventory I was describing earlier, that you have forms of capital that you can and must circulate in the wider community and for your country and for the planet, right? Now, sometimes at work, that may mean leading a conversation that is uncomfortable about why is there a gender imbalance here? Or about why is it that we're all the slow beneficiaries of gentrification and and the concentration of wealth in the Bay Area, but what are our responsibilities to the wider community, right? Yeah, a little awkward, right? A little bit uncomfortable. And part of what we all have to be doing in small ways right now is to lean into discomfort, right? Now, for those of you who are leaders and managers, at the company, for not just Reid Hoffman, but for people who lead teams in this organization, that means you have a special responsibility to hold that space, right? To make it possible for people to engage in these kinds of conversations non-defensively and without kind of an immediate penalty of, oh gosh, you've said something that is kind of against, out of bounds. That this especially, perhaps more than some tech organizations, is a learning community. LinkedIn exists because people are hungry. Your millions, your hundreds of millions or billions of members and users out in the world are hungry to learn and skill up and to kind of understand how they can be more effective in their careers, right? That is completely overlapping with how we can skill up and become more powerful and more effective in our lives as citizens. How do you make yourself heard? How do you frame ideas in a way that's compelling to people? How do you persuade people to join you in an idea and an effort? How do you push against an entrenched status quo? How do you upend an unfair setup, right? How do you disrupt? I've just given a LinkedIn job description, but I've also given a citizen of the United States description, right? And these responsibilities for us to disrupt, to own our piece, and to hold up our corner of the whole system, if LinkedIn can make it a culture where you're circulating that kind of learning, and what you learn at work, you apply in the community. What you apply in the community, you bring back to work. You can actually model for the rest of the Valley and the tech industry a better way to be citizens and members of the body. Thank you so much. We can continue chatting as those of us will sign books here. Really appreciate this opportunity.
Yes. Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you to those of you who showed up today. Thanks to those folks who showed up on the stream. And in the incredible words of wisdom of Eric's parents, don't be useless. Thanks so much.
Thank you.